Well, this is the last session of our work, and before starting with my introduction to this debate, let me say that our special thanks go to Carlo Alberto, thank you. Carlo, you did believe in this project from the beginning. We thank you for the opportunity to be here in Venice, in the center of Venice, and let's thank him with a big applause. Thank you, Carlo. So, what is science? That's the question. If we consider science from a traditional Aristotelian and Thomistic point of view, science can be regarded, in Latin, as the cognitio certa rerum per causas, which is the clear knowledge of something through its causes. An example, everyone can see a solar eclipse, and this is the fact. But only he who knows the causes of the eclipse does possess the scientific knowledge. There is a modern bias on the way in which science is currently understood. It is often believed that science has only to do with measurable things, with the empirical, material level of reality. However, keeping in mind the traditional definition of science, the one we gave before, the scientific knowledge does represent an inquiry which is based on three conditions, as explained by some philosophers of science. First of all, an object, the object of the inquiry, which can also be non-empirical, as it happens, for example, in mathematics, social sciences, and even theology. Yes, because even theology can be a science. Second, the application of a logical reasoning, in order to ensure the coherence between premises and conclusions. And third, an epistemological foundation, that is, how do we proceed in a given science? In physics, for example, one has to test a theory using the experiments, and the results of the experiments have to be explainable with that theory. If not, there is a problem. Given these premises, science and scientific explanation are not necessarily confined to the empirical, tangible level. The ID theory is a good example in this sense. We can also consider that there are aspects of reality and also of our most common experience which cannot be the object of the empirical, natural, physical sciences. Natural sciences do expose a number of notions on the earth, the universe, the human body, the living systems, but they don't explain, for example, the beauty of a mountain landscape. Natural sciences can describe how a mountain does form, but not we find it beautiful. Beauty cannot be entirely reduced to mathematical formulas. Thus, some aspects of reality can only be seized by the intellect, by the intelligent creator, because they do transcend the empirical dimension, as it happens, for example, with moral values. Natural sciences, experiments, and empirical observations don't exhaust reality. In this sense, there are two different philosophical approaches to the study of nature. I call them the absolutistic approach and the open approach. The absolutistic approach is a complete trust in methodological and or ontological materialism. Since the senses can feel nothing except material things, and since one cannot make experiments and observations on immaterial entities, then our reality is material, or does come from pure matter. After receiving a complaint from Napoleon because he hadn't mentioned God in a book on the universe, the French astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace answered him, "Je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse," which is, "Sir, I had no need of that hypothesis," which is, I didn't need God in order to explain the universe. And then there is the open approach, which accepts the idea that the best explanation for what we observe in nature and for nature itself is not necessary or completely matter. The Belgian cosmologist and Catholic priest Georges Lemaitre declared in 1933, talking about his own career as a scientist and as a priest during an interview, "There were two ways of arriving at the truth. I decided to follow them both." Unfortunately, something happened during the development of modern science after Galileo. A bias was gradually created which assumes the idea that science has to be materialistic. As everyone knows, a great revolution in the instrumental communication took place during the 17th century in Europe, with the introduction of telescope, microscope, barometer, and so on. The new instruments played a fundamental role for an unprecedented, detailed analysis of the quantitative aspects of the physical phenomena. This was the birth of the precise quantitative modern science in the micro and in the macro universe. And this was really a great innovation because new worlds were discovered. However, all this was also accompanied by an epistemological, philosophical, and even psychological transition or adaptation, I don't know exactly how to call it, which generated a misunderstanding, the persuasion that only quantitative science is science. The path to this was long and complicated, but at the end there was the idea that something is objective, scientific, only if it has to do, starting and finishing, with the empirical dimension, which is also the level of the instruments, the physical observations, the material entities. From this context, metaphysics and theology began to be regarded as something bizarre, surely non-scientific. This has also been, as we all know, today's destiny of the ID theory. And honestly, even Galileo wrote in his Il Saggiatore, 1623, that you can read the book of nature only mathematically, not partially mathematically, but only mathematically. He who doesn't know mathematics cannot read it. And he also affirms non tentar l'essenza, which is don't enter the essences, don't enter metaphysics. In the 17th and in the 18th centuries, the introductions of more precise and sophisticated tools for measuring time reinforced the mechanistic paradigm of nature. The universe was now seen as a great machine based on precise rules. Rules and machine had been created by God, but after the initial act of creation, the universe was let alone, totally independent. From here to the idea of a self-sufficient universe, the passage was maybe gradual, but inevitable, as it was the subsequent passage from here to scientism. In 1781, Immanuel Kant writes, "Keine Metaphysik mehr," which is no more metaphysics. However, as Aristotle thinks, quantity is only an aspect of nature. It is only one aspect of the substance. And metaphysics, we should remind, has not necessarily to do with religion and faith. Metaphysics only means going beyond physics, from the Greek meta, ta, physica. Here is the philosophical mistake. One cannot affirm that since immaterial entities are not measurable, then they don't exist. Are justice and truth measurable? No. But they do exist and have been the subject matter of a serious scientific inquiry in the history of philosophy and theology. Metaphysical entities are not measurable. Anyway, they are knowable. Dr. Laskin and Dr. Koyonen, now it's your turn to discuss a topic which is very relevant for the relationships between science and theology. The topic is very delicate. It has to do with evolution, the nature of evolution, and ID. Here are some possible questions. What is mainstream evolution? Which model of evolution does Rope propose? Are design and evolution compatible? In other words, can we admit a designed evolution? Now, we'll have a debate between Rope and Casey regarding the compatibility or non-compatibility of evolution and design. 15 minutes for each speaker are foreseen, but even if you take 20 minutes, I won't beat you, so from 15 to 20 minutes. After that, each opponent will have 5 more minutes for a reply. A debate with the auditorium will then follow, a debate on all day. Please, Rope, now the stage is yours, and in the meanwhile, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also Carlo and Casey for inviting me. I believe it was Casey's idea in the first place to get this kind of discussion going, and I think this kind of dialogue between different perspectives is quite important for testing our ideas and getting clarity on where we stand, what are the strong ideas. As the Book of Proverbs also says, that each person seems to be right when you only hear their case. You need a counter-argument to get some clarity. I believe also that our debate, is evolution compatible with biological design arguments, is going to be interesting to many, regardless of where they stand on this issue, because it touches on issues like the compatibility of natural explanations and divine action in general. And many people here have already suggested that perhaps some kind of evolution might be compatible with design, but other kinds of evolution might not. So it is an important issue to consider to what extent might evolution be compatible with design, and what ways might we test different models of design also against each other, perhaps an evolution-friendly version of design, or perhaps a version of design which has more of this miraculous action or other kind of divine action in nature. So me and Casey have already been discussing this topic in a bit. So this discussion perhaps started with my book, The Compatibility of Evolution and Design. I have one copy with me for someone who wants it after this discussion. Casey and several colleagues at the Discovery Institute then wrote a very long, robust reply to the book, where they tried to analyze its arguments in a very collegial way, very friendly way, but ultimately ended up concluding that the book is completely self-contradictory and ends up undermining the whole idea of design, and you actually can't get design and evolution to be compatible. I've then written a reply to Casey in turn, which is still in press, but it's already available online at my Academia Edu page, but it will appear as an open access article also in the journal Theology and Science. And if someone is too anxious to get a copy, I also have one copy of this response article. But our two main disagreements perhaps on design are whether design arguments need to be scientific, first of all, and whether, secondly, is detecting design in biology compatible with a continuous evolutionary process, and an evolutionary process that natural selection and random mutation play a very large role in, and all kinds of these kinds of mechanisms that are discussed in mainstream evolutionary biology. We agree that there's plenty of evidence of design in nature. We agree that nature points to its creator in some way. I would even say that perhaps I believe in this even more than Casey, because I think it doesn't depend on our rejection of evolution. If insofar as evolutionary processes like random mutation and natural selection are able to produce, for example, the wonderful mechanisms involved in human childbirth, then to that extent this will then be a process designed by God most credibly in my view. And I was also delighted to see in these presentations that there was some different perspectives on whether design arguments are part of science. For example, Professor Krabbe in his presentation on the fine-tuning of the cosmos stated that both the multiverse and design are ultimately outside the realm of science, that they are philosophical and theological positions both from which one has to choose. Others then argued that perhaps design is a scientific idea because, for example, design uses a kind of abductive methodology of the same type that is used in the sciences. Well, as a theologian, I would say that if that is sufficient for science, then of course our theological arguments about God or against God are also scientific because we use abductive logic in quite a lot of these. So then we have to answer, why isn't God a scientific hypothesis? But there are, I think, arguments to be made in favor of saying that design arguments at least have portions that are scientific. And to my mind, the question isn't really that important. I don't really care what label you stick on the design argument. What I care is whether the argument is a good argument, because I don't think good arguments are restricted to science. I think most of our beliefs actually come from outside science, whether it's from selecting or finding out the person who loves us and who we love, that's not a science, or whether it's an issue of morality or issues of how do I know what I ate for breakfast. Those are not scientific beliefs, and they are still true. So now on to the core question of our disagreement today. Is detecting design in biology compatible with a continuous evolutionary process? So quite a lot of arguments in favor of design start from this kind of assumption that there is a conflict. And so we explore very much in this conference also the way of how might we then argue against evolution and argue for design in that way. But it's taken, in my view, then far too easily swallowed the idea that evolution itself would be sufficient evidence against design. It's as if we have this kind of decision tree, We have to make the decision first, is evolution in conflict with design or not? And then we have chosen the idea of conflict, and then we start developing our design arguments from there. But I think there is also quite a lot to be said for design even taking evolution into account. And even if we accept in its totality all the evolutionary mechanisms, I think we can still argue for design quite well. And this argument, of course, is not new. It was argued, for instance, by Asa Gray, the American botanist, who was the main popularizer, perhaps, of evolutionary biology in its early days in the United States. And Gray was in correspondence with Darwin. Gray wrote several articles defending the idea of design as an interpretation of evolution. And what Gray says is that this evolutionary theory actually doesn't alter the conclusion, because it just all comes down to the issue of chance versus design in the end. Does evolution have the kind of property that allow for the emergence of design by chance, or does it have them by design? And Gray says design is the far better explanation. Gray means to support William Paley's old design argument and say that it's the properties of living beings, such as the arrangement, disposition of parts, and so on, that imply the presence of intelligence and mind. And Gray says that if we can look at, say, an archaeological arrowhead and conclude that there must have been an intelligent agent living sometime in the past there, then how is it possible that we look at something like the human eye or the human hand and do not conclude that there must have been a designer behind this process? But for Gray, evolution doesn't threaten this conclusion at all. It's rather just one more example of many, many processes in nature that by their orderly nature testify to the Creator. It's not an isolated instance in which God acts through a natural process, rather it's one out of many, many such examples. So Gray thinks that we have already quite a lot of reason to accept this kind of logic of compatibility, and we just now have to also apply it to the case of evolution. If we take this as the abductive argument or an inference to the best explanation, we just ask if evolution produces this kind of order, then is it more likely that nature was not designed or that nature was designed to produce evolution? And that's the basic Asa-Gray argument. But of course, there's quite a lot of objections that come up to this, and in this brief opening remark, I'm going to go through just a couple of them, and I'm sure Casey will have many more, and you might have some additional ones as well. Well, here's Darwin, and the first objection is that Darwin and many others do disagree with Gray's interpretation of evolution. So there's no shortage of quotations from both Darwin and from evolutionary biologists since, who do insist that evolution has to be an unguided process, a process that has no intelligence involved in it in any way. And Darwin himself, in his correspondence with Gray, criticized Gray's interpretation of evolutionary biology. He argued also in his autobiography that Paley's design argument no longer is valid now that the law of natural selection is discovered. So we might say that, well, how could this be then a version of mainstream evolution anymore if you are trying to say that it's designed? But of course, one problem here is that, well, there's two problems actually. The first problem is that people's interpretations of their discoveries are not necessarily always correct. And Darwin, in making this philosophical interpretation, was not necessarily acting in his best scientific expertise. And he didn't actually make this interpretation even in his Origin of Species book. The Origin actually presents evolution as a kind of law-like mechanism created by God and put in place by God. Darwin writes in his correspondence also that when writing the Origin, he could have been considered a theist. But we can see, of course, many examples of this where people's interpretations of their own theories and discoveries are not necessarily correct. Maybe some people remember the Soviet propaganda of Gagarin's good old space journey. Gagarin, as the first man to space, was then reported as saying that he flew into space but didn't see any God there. Now it's disputed whether Gagarin ever said anything like this, but this is what Nikita Khrushchev apparently interpreted the meaning of this space explanation as being. Now, was Gagarin right? Now, one way to criticize his argument might be to say that maybe he didn't go into space, or maybe he didn't do any discoveries there, so we might try to disregard his science. That's not very, very plausible. But another way would be to argue that Gagarin is just getting the theology wrong. Despite being a good space explorer, he wasn't a theologian or a philosopher, and if you ask a theologian or a philosopher, you will very soon discover that almost nobody in the history of Christian or Jewish or Muslim thought would have thought that if you fly into space, you are going to find God in there. Maybe you can find some people who think that God and the angels do live above the clouds, but that's not going to be the mainstream theological position or the only alternative, at least. So we can say that there's actually no conflict here, despite the discoverer saying otherwise. Secondly, of course, we know that Darwin's own ideas on the topic were actually very complex. We can also find examples of evolutionists, such as Georges Romanes, Darwin's disciple, who thought that maybe evolution doesn't say anything either way, actually, on this issue of design. It just leaves it open. And Darwin continued to struggle with this feeling of design also in nature, despite being an agnostic into his late age. So that's why we can't just look at, what's the popular philosophical interpretation of evolution. We have to actually look at the claims, the scientific claims of evolutionary theory. What does it say about random mutation, natural selection, and so on? And do those claims actually imply that there cannot be a designer? Do those claims actually overturn the design argument, even if we accept them as correct? So the second objection I'll go through is that based on the principle of simplicity, popularly known as Occam's razor, after the medieval philosopher Willem of Occam. So the basic idea is that we should prefer simple explanations. So as creationist John Woodmorope put this, one doesn't need both a tractor and a horse to pull the plow, and if you have a tractor, you don't need to suppose that there's also an invisible horse that is pulling the tractor. If you have one explanation, that's enough. You just keep it simple and don't multiply explanations beyond necessity. So the basic idea is that, well, if you have evolutionary explanations for all this biological complexity, then why would you need to add God? And on the other hand, if you have God or an intelligent designer who shall remain unidentified, then why would you need evolution? Why would such a designer need to set up a process? The designer can just create this complexity directly. But actually, in response, we can say that simplicity is certainly not the only criterion of a good explanation. Rather, we also actually have quite a lot of examples where we need multiple explanations working together. Even within biology itself, evolutionary biology itself is a collection of many different explanations. No science actually studies all of reality. To get the picture of all of reality, you have to combine the sciences. And this is so it's important for both science and religious belief to be able to combine explanations. And the crucial issue is that simplicity only bars multiple explanations when they are unnecessary, when they add no explanatory power. And of course, this was already said within theology before Occam by people like Thomas Aquinas, for example, who said that actually the fullness of natural explanations doesn't make God unnecessary. Nevertheless, already very early on in his Summa Theologica, that's where he presented his 5 ways to know God. And there's a new nice work also on this. For example, this book, Conjunctive Explanations in Science and Religion, where I have an article on Asa Gray and Darwin. So this is an important concept. But theologically, of course, as Asa Gray pointed out, there's quite a lot of examples where we do need natural explanations and some kind of design to work together. So no matter what you think about the particular case of evolution, you do have to respond to this concern of simplicity somehow if you want to hold both theological and scientific explanations together. For example, someone might say, following Laplace's example, that if once we have the law of gravity, of course we don't need any God who's standing behind that law of gravity. Or perhaps once we have the laws and processes that govern weather, then we don't need to talk about how God gives us rain and fruitful seasons, which the Apostle Paul uses as evidence of God. And once we have, the Laplacian or the modern scientific hypothesis of the formation of stars, then we don't need God at all. So we do need some kind of model of the compatibility of natural explanations and God, no matter what. But there have actually been some authors who have argued even that the fine-tuning is actually evidence against God, because God, if he wanted to create us, wouldn't need any fine-tuning. On this model, then miracles would be the only allowed form of God's action in nature. So we do need some kind of theory of how this go together. Actually, we also find in both creationist and ID movement thinkers the same kind of appreciation for many orderly phenomena. So nobody actually thinks that it's only the exceptions to the laws of nature that should be allowed as examples of divine action. Here's, for example, Snowflake Bentley, Wilson Bentley, who studied the snowflakes, and creationist Jerry Berkman argues that these miracles of beauty are evidence of God's design, even though they arise out of these very regular, scientifically observable and repeatable processes, that where we don't find any kind of gaps in our scientific explanation. Nevertheless, he thinks that the beauty somehow points to the great designer. Or here's William Dembski, one of the key thinkers of cases ID 1.0, who has now also returned to work at the movements once again. Dembski argues that intelligent design is perfectly compatible with all the design in the world coming to expression by the ordinary means of secondary cause over the course of natural history. So intelligent design is not a theory about the frequency or locality or modality by which the designing intelligence intervenes in the material world. So in practice then, we might have perhaps many different models of intelligent design. It seems that some models here at least do presuppose that intelligent design does want to say something about the frequency, locality, and modality of the designer's actions, also to make predictions based on these. For example, when you start to say something about this, you start to develop, for example, a model of evolutionary design or a model of interventions into history, then you might get more specific scientific predictions, though that actually might be useful. But nevertheless, there is an important discussion to be had over how much competition between natural explanations and design-based explanations actually is needed for ID theory. So I'm going to skip the rest, but just to say that, of course, much more could be said. There's a vast literature, and there's much more coming out as well. Here on the left is my forthcoming volume, an edited volume on the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim history of design arguments, which I also believe is very interesting. And with that, I've come to the end of my remarks and turn it over to Casey. Thank you.
Okay, you guys want to? Yeah, there we go. Okay, I'm not one of the taller guys here. So thank you so much, Roope, for that very nice presentation. We're going to discuss today in detail Roope Kojonen's proposal of designed evolution and ask whether or not it is a viable model for intelligent design. And before I get going, I want to ask you guys, does anybody recognize the background image on this opening slide here? Anybody know where this is from? This is from the creation sequence at St. Mark's Basilica, right down the street here. So if you go in there, go look up at one of the domes, and you can see this is the creation sequence. And I found this online. I didn't take this picture. I purchased it legally, though. So anyway, so I want to make some opening positive comments. I think that Roope is a very thoughtful participant in the ID evolution conversation. His book is well argued, balanced, carefully thought out, and presents a very formidable case. And so I'm very grateful to share the stage with him today. He's an extremely civil and well-informed critic, and I think it's safe to say we both agree that science and religion are friends. We just might disagree on exactly what this looks like, what form it takes. So I've kind of fallen in love with making AI images. I think, Roope, you had a few AI images there. So I managed to make this one of a scientist and a priest shaking hands here, you know. So I think that science and religion are certainly friends, but we can have a very friendly dialogue about what this looks like. And of course, as Roope said, this is a conversation that has been going on for a while. By the way, somebody told me not to talk so loud, so I will do my best to keep it down. I get a little bit just normally excited, though, so I apologize. But I would encourage you all to read Roope's book, The Compatibility of Evolution and Design. Here's a QR code to his book where you can find it online. And then for our paper that we wrote responding to it, there's a QR code you can get where you can read our response. And I look forward to seeing Roope's response when it comes out in print. That'll be really nice. So what we have here are two competing models of intelligent design. Roope has presented a model of intelligent design where the locus of design is in the evolutionary process itself. And he seeks to reconcile design with what he calls mainstream evolution. In his designed evolution model, mutations are channeled to produce advantageous outcomes, in particular things like new proteins or new protein folds. And because of the existence of what he would basically call a designed fitness landscape, designing the laws of nature to allow for these new proteins to evolve, what we might call propitious pathways through protein sequence space, allows us to evolve stable protein folds one from another. So you can basically evolve all the grand diversity of new proteins in living organisms, one mutation at a time, through a standard evolutionary mechanism, random mutation, natural selection, because these sequence spaces are designed to allow for this evolution to take place. But what's interesting is when you read his book, he says that evolution by itself needs some help to produce biological complexity. And it needs to be, basically there is fine-tuning that is required by evolution. And he says that forms must be arranged in a way that makes the evolutionary search through it possible, basically saying that you have to have sequence space set up in a certain way to let evolution work, and if you don't have this fine-tuning, evolution might not work. So his model sees his model as an alternative to what I might call a more classical design model that sees each separate protein fold or protein superfamily and the genetic information necessary to produce them as the product of discrete instances of intelligent design. So this alternative model sees the protein folds themselves as the locus of design. In other words, each protein fold itself is a discrete instance of design. So these are sort of two competing models of what intelligent design looks like. Under his model, you have design through a continuous evolutionary process. Under the model that I will be defending, you have design where basically you have discrete instances of design, and you cannot see that a continuous evolutionary process can produce all the grand diversity of life. So I would say that both sides in this debate accept a very interesting fact, and that is the extreme rarity of genes and proteins in sequence space. By the way, one of the other things I did for fun using AI images was I said, make me a 13th century mosaic of an enzyme. And so I got all these weird pictures that AI imagined. I'll splash these throughout my presentation here, and you can see, when you go to St. Mark's, there's all these beautiful mosaics there. What would it look like if they were making mosaics of an enzyme? And this is what AI came up with. Anyway, okay, so before we get into this, what is a protein? Proteins are basically long chains of amino acids that are folded up into a particular shape to form a particular function. And this folded functional state of a protein is called its tertiary structure. And we talked about the likelihood of generating a functional protein in my previous presentation. And Dr. Doug Axe has asked this question: how common or rare are functional sequences, i.e., functional proteins, among all the possible combinations of amino acids in amino acid sequence space? So we asked this question: for every functional protein, how many non-functional sequences exist? And for beta-lactamase, which is a very typical sort of enzyme, globular enzyme, he found that only 1 in 10 to the 77th sequences will yield a functional protein. Okay, so this is very, very rare. Functional proteins are very, very rare in sequence space. And many different studies have confirmed this idea that functional protein sequences are very rare. If you go through the literature, these are just a survey. This is compiled by my colleague Brian Miller at Discovery Institute. You go through the literature, you find that there's many different studies that have found that functional protein sequences are very, very rare. So the key question we can ask is, were there enough trials over time, over the history of the Earth, to produce and find such a rare structure in sequence space? And I want you to consider this very interesting fact. There have only been about 10 to the 38th to 10 to the 40th organisms that have ever lived over the entire history of life on Earth. Depends on who you ask. We can just take, the upper limit, 10 to the 40th organisms. So let's say that there were 10 to the 40th organisms that have lived over the entire history of life on Earth. If we make this sort of extremely generous assumption to the evolutionary process that every single organism that has ever lived was granted a sort of random sequence of amino acids in hopes that it would give it a functional protein, could you produce something like a beta-lactamase enzyme? And so you can see here, you take the number of trials available over the entire history of the Earth, and the number of sequences need to be searched, 10 to the 77th. You're still short by about 10 to the 37th trials, okay? So we can make a conclusion here. There's sort of prima facie evidence here that natural selection acting on random mutation does not have enough opportunities over the history of life on Earth to find these rare protein folds that we see in life. So the evolutionary process must either be directed towards novel proteins through the kind of fine-tuning that Rope is talking about, or protein folds must be the result of discrete instances of intelligent design in the history of life. So again, we want to ask the question, which model is correct? Well, both sides in this debate accept, again, I think the extreme rarity of genes and proteins in sequence space. But Rope thinks that the evolutionary process is directed towards new proteins, and sequence space is sort of rigged or fine-tuned to allow you to evolve from one protein sequence to another. And he envisions that a fitness landscape looks kind of like this. You remember the fitness landscapes that we talked about in the previous presentation? Well, he would say that if you look at sequence space, you get sort of maybe a lot of sequence space is actually empty. It won't produce functional proteins, but maybe you get these very nice ridges and pathways through sequence space that can allow you to evolve from one functional sequence to another. So if you're over here and you want to get here, yes, functional sequences are rare, but maybe you can find these very sort of propitious pathways through sequence space to get from one functional sequence to another and allow evolution to take place. Another way to look at it is like this. Maybe you have a very, very large ocean with just a little bit of land in it, but maybe you have these land sections in the middle of the oceans, these islands, but they might be connected by these very thin land bridges, okay? So that's the way that Rope would see you could walk from one island to another. Islands might be very rare, but they might be connected by these very thin land bridges. But it also might be the case that you have these very rare islands in the oceans or in sequence space, and they're not connected, okay? You can't walk from one island to another. So if you want to you can't basically get from this island to this island by walking. You have to have some other way of transporting you there. You can't have, as Rope would say, a continuous evolutionary process. You need some other process to generate these new sequences. So another way to look at this then, if you think back to what a fitness landscape looks like, this is from a paper in PLOS One, is you might have a fitness landscape where basically you have these high fitness peaks, okay? Sort of these plateaus within fitness sequence space that are very, very high function. But if you want to get from one plateau to another, you're going to go through these fitness valleys where you go down in fitness, you don't have a functional sequence anymore, and you're basically going to be dead. And natural selection is not going to preserve you. You're not going to be able to evolve from one plateau to another because you're going to go through this fitness valley or this dead zone or this abyss in sequence space where you can't survive, okay? So I'm going to make 3 critiques of the continuous picture of protein sequence space and thus the designed evolutionary theory of the origin of protein folds. Number 1, the continuous picture of protein fold sequence space is mathematically implausible. The extreme rarity entails extreme isolation in sequence space, mathematically speaking, and something called percolation theory confirms this. So when we talk about extreme rarity, that necessitates that these rare sequences are also isolated in sequence space. You can't evolve from one to another. Second point I'm going to make is that this continuous picture of protein fold sequence space is contrary to experimental or empirical studies. Specifically, multiple mutagenesis experiments have shown that as mutations accumulate, they inevitably will degrade and destabilize existing protein folds long before you can get enough mutations to produce a new or evolve a new protein fold. So this basically leaves these protein folds separated and isolated from one another in sequence space. And then finally, there's theoretical problems. The physics and thermodynamics of fold stabilization shows why random mutations will quickly degrade and destabilize functional protein folds. So Rope said before this that he might be talking about more theology, and I'd be talking more about science. So hopefully we'll have some engagement in the the responses, and the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to just focus on the science. So our first critique is that the extreme rarity in sequence space entails extreme isolation, and percolation theory confirms this. So let's think about if you want to walk from Los Angeles to Tokyo. I actually grew up in LA, and I can tell you, you cannot walk from Los Angeles to Tokyo because Earth does not have enough land to do that. It simply cannot be done. But we can envision many different types of planets, some with more land, some with less land. When there's more land, you might actually be able to walk from Los Angeles to Tokyo. This would be a very traversable planet. Some planets with less land would be very non-traversable. So let's compare the rarity of Axe's research to a planet and how much land would be on that planet. How much could you walk around on that planet? So just to use this analogy, we're going to sort of mix metaphors here of a planet with land and how big would it have to be and how much land would it have. So the extreme rarity of Axe's results that only 1 in, 5 minutes. I have 7 minutes because I started, anyway, this is from when I started. 20 minutes. So the extreme rarity of the beta-lactamase domain studied by Axe would correspond to a planet the size of our entire galaxy, and the total navigable land would correspond to the surface area of a single atom, okay? So if you want to navigate sequence space, there's not much navigable land. And I would say that intuition confirms that if you have such a small amount of navigable land, it's exceedingly unlikely that you'll be able to move from one end of the planet to another along a continuous path. So if you want to get from this point to this point, say from this atom to this atom in your planet, there's not enough land to get you there under this sort of a rarity of land. So the question we could ask is, what percent of our galaxy-sized planet would need to be filled in with land before such a path would become likely? And this is the kind of question that something called percolation theory can answer. So what is percolation theory? Percolation theory basically is a mathematical field which asks what percent of a space needs to be filled in, randomly speaking, before a continuous path becomes likely. So if you look at this maze here, the white cells are the traversable cells and the gray cells are the non-traversable cells. In this, and we just randomly populated this, in this maze, there's not enough traversable cells to go from one side of the maze up here down to the other side of the maze. Because what we would say is that the amount of filled in land is below what's called the percolation threshold. Too few cells are populated for a continuous path to be likely in the maze is untraversable. Well, what about this maze? Here, we have a lot more land that is traversable, and we are now above what is called the percolation threshold, which makes the continuous paths likely through this maze, and the maze is traversable. So my colleague at Discovery Institute, Dr. Brian Miller, has calculated the percolation threshold for your ability to evolve proteins in sequence space. And it's only about 1 in 3,000. What that means, we can round this down to 1 in 10,000, okay? What this means is that if less than 1 in 10,000 amino acid sequences are functional within some section of sequence space, then random mutation and blind natural selection cannot evolve from one sequence to another, okay? That's a very, very high percolation threshold. And if sequence space is not populated at this level, at least 1 in 10,000 sequences being functional, then it is not likely you're going to be able to evolve from one functional sequence to another. So if you go back to this chart where we talked about all the rarity of these different proteins that have been discovered, basically every single one of these is below the percolation threshold for proteins. And below this line, these black lines, they're also below sort of this thought experiment I gave earlier, where every single organism that has ever lived has been granted this, random sequence of amino acids, hoping to give you a functional protein. But every single one of these proteins from this that is listed in this table is below the percolation threshold for protein. So that means that for many types of proteins, they are simply too isolated in sequence space for functional paths between one type of protein and another to be likely. Now, a proponent of designed evolution may respond that the likelihood of these propitious pathways in sequence space is irrelevant because God could specially design or fine-tune sequence space to make evolution possible. However, there's a problem with this argument, and that is that it contradicts empirical studies. Mutagenesis experiments shows that we don't see these nice stepping stones through sequence space to get you through a sort of a very nicely arranged pathway from one protein sequence to another. We actually see that you can't get there, that protein sequence space is not very well populated. How do we see this? Well, there's been research done by an Israeli biochemist named Dan Tofik, who sadly passed away a few years ago in a tragic accident. And what he has done is he's done research on mutating proteins, and what he's found is that accumulating random mutations in a protein will quickly degrade the structural and thermodynamic stability of the protein folds. And typically mutations to just about 10% of a protein are sufficient to degrade or destabilize the fold. And that folded stable tertiary protein structure is lost long before mutations could generate some new protein fold. And his work applies to large classes of globular proteins, roughly spherically shaped proteins, not just the beta-lactamase enzyme that Doug Axe studied. And he characterized the origin of novel protein folds as, quote, something close to a miracle. He was not an ID proponent, but he saw that there was a problem for the evolutionary theory. So this is sort of the crucial point here, and I'm almost done. We'll get this done by the time. He found that different protein folds typically exhibit 65 to 70% or more sequences, differences in their sequence from one another in protein sequence space, and that protein superfamilies, sort of very diverse groups of proteins, are typically 80% different in their sequences, okay? However, experiments show that protein folds are degraded and non-functional once they accumulate around 10% of random mutations. So therefore, random mutations will inevitably degrade the structure of an existing protein fold long before they will ever produce enough mutations to generate a new fold. In other words, the number of mutations you need to get a new fold will destroy the functional fold of the original protein long before you get the new fold. Let me sort of display this to you in a diagram here. Let's say we're starting with this protein here, and we're going to randomly mutate various percentages of this protein sequence, okay? And if we want to get a new protein fold, we got to mutate at least, say, 65% of this protein sequence, all right? Well, the problem is that once you start to mutate about 10% of the protein sequence, you're going to destabilize that fold, and you're going to not have any function anymore. You're going to go into basically a functional abyss in sequence space. So if you think of this through a fitness landscape, as you start to mutate this protein randomly, pretty quickly you're going to destabilize the fold, and at about 10%, you're going to be dead. You're going to have a fitness value of 0, and you're going to stay there until you somehow randomly stumble upon a new protein fold after mutating about 65% of it. Once you get into this zone, natural selection and random mutation will not take you any further. So that's the problem, okay? So what Toffa concluded is that proteins in different superfamilies have no connection to one another, and they're like being in isolated galaxies. And he said that researchers have zero knowledge of how these superfamilies are related or could have originated. Okay, so last critique here, and this is the thermodynamics and physics of fold stabilization. Studies have shown that stabilizing a protein fold requires a decrease of between 3 to 15 kilocalories per mole in Gibbs free energy to go from the unfolded to the folded state. You want the folded state to have a lower free energy than the unfolded state, and then it becomes energetically favorable. But studies have also shown that as random mutations accumulate, the free energy associated with a protein fold will increase at about 1 kilocalorie per mole per mutation, thus resulting in a measurable and progressive destabilization of the protein fold. So this gives us a theoretical reason to understand why we see this, okay? As you mutate the protein, you get lower fitness, and then it takes a long time before you get a new fitness function. So what we're seeing really is we do not see these stepping stones through sequence space to get you on a continuous evolutionary path from one protein fold to another. Instead, sequence space looks like this or something like this, where these functional plateaus are isolated. So final point. Rope has talked a lot about what God could do. And I don't dispute that, God could have made life and the universe in many ways. He could fine-tune the universe to allow for this evolution to take place. I'm asking the question right now, what God did do, and all the empirical data on protein stability and the theoretical evidence we have from the physics of fold stabilization indicates we have a discontinuous sequence landscape, and it was not produced by a continuous evolutionary process. So I think the evidence shows that God did not do it the way that Professor Koyonen is proposing. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.